The Black Widow's dress stood stark against the auction platform. Eleanor Cridge clutched her swollen belly, face pale but defiant as Cold Creek's afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. $50. Who'll take this pregnant widow and her debts? Mayor Wilson called, triggering snickers from the crowd. No one knew she once owned the valley's most beautiful farm. The wind whispered cold and cutting, the kind that made folks turn their collars and mind their business. Men in dusty hats shuffled, avoiding her eyes yet unable to look away. Shame had a particular gravity in Cold Creek, pulling gazes down while keeping tongues wagging. She's healthy enough, her brother-in-law Charles sneered, gripping her arm too tight. Child's due in a month. Strong stock. Could be of use if you need help around your place. Eleanor didn't cry. Tears were luxuries for women with choices. 3 months a widow, 6 months with child, and now property to be sold. Her husband Robert's debts had become her shackles after the fever took him. No man to provide for her, Mayor Wilson continued. And everyone knows a woman can't manage land alone. Thomas Reed stood at the edge of the crowd, tall and weathered as the mountain behind him. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words this month, and he preferred it that way. Silence didn't judge. Silence didn't remind him of the wife and child buried beneath the cottonwood tree. But something about the hollow look in Eleanor's eyes drew him forward. Not pleading, not broken, but eerily familiar. $75, Thomas said, his voice rough from disuse. The crowd turned. Thomas Reed never involved himself in town affairs. He lived alone on his struggling ranch miles outside Cold Creek, appearing only when necessary for supplies. Charles's face darkened. This isn't your business, Reed. I'm making it my business. Thomas stepped closer, leather boots leaving dusty prints on the wooden platform. $100. Mayor Wilson's eyebrows shot up. The lady comes with considerable debts, Mr. Reed. Her husband borrowed against that small farm of hers. Banks owed nearly $400. How convenient, Thomas replied, eyes narrowing. Robert Cridge was a careful man. Eleanor's gaze snapped at Thomas. She'd never exchanged words with the rancher, but everyone knew his story. How he'd lost his family to scarlet fever 3 winters ago. How he'd withdrawn from the world afterward. $450, Thomas said flatly, pulling a leather pouch from his coat. For the debts and the widow's freedom. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Charles stepped forward, face flushed with anger. Now, wait just a minute. Count it, Thomas interrupted, tossing the pouch to Mayor Wilson. Every penny owed to the bank, plus 50 for your troubles. The mayor's fingers worked quickly, greed overcoming surprise. He nodded reluctantly. It's all here. Thomas turned to Eleanor, offering his hand but not touching her. Mrs. Cridge, you don't have to come with me, but I'll see you safely wherever you want to go. Eleanor hesitated, one hand still protectively curved around her belly. Charles had been ruthless since Robert's death, taking everything not nailed down, working toward taking her land too. The stranger offered escape, but from one cage to another? Why? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Because what they're doing isn't right, Thomas answered simply. Eleanor stood straighter, maternal instinct overruling pride. I'll come. They walked through Cold Creek like ghosts, her black dress billowing slightly in the wind, his tall frame a shield between her and prying eyes. No one stopped them, though plenty stared. Guilt makes cowards of decent folk. Thomas helped her into his wagon, careful not to touch her more than necessary. She sat with hands folded over her belly, staring ahead like a woman heading toward an unknown fate. You don't owe me anything, Thomas said as they left town behind. There's a small cabin on the north end of my property. You can stay there until you decide what you want to do. It's not much, but it's private. Eleanor studied him, searching for hidden motives. Finding none, she simply nodded. I'm not a man who saves people, he added quietly. Just couldn't stomach what was happening back there. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Miles of prairie grass swayed in the wind, and clouds gathered on the horizon promising rain. They took everything after Robert died, Eleanor finally said a widow couldn't pay her husband's debts otherwise. I didn't even know about half those loans. Thomas's jaw tightened. Some men prey on widows. It's an old story. Not my story, Eleanor replied, a spark flickering in her eyes. Not anymore. The cabin was small but sound. One room with a stone fireplace, simple bed, table with 2 chairs, and a small stove. Thomas lit the lamps and fire, then stepped back toward the door. I'll bring supplies in the morning, he said. My house is just over that rise, if you need anything before then. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, black dress making her seem like a shadow against the warm lamplight. Thank you, Mr. Reed. He nodded once and left, boots crunching on the gravel path. Alone, Eleanor sank onto bed, finally allowing tears to fall. Not from despair. Those tears had dried up after Robert's funeral. These were from something dangerously close to relief. Dawn broke misty and cool. Eleanor woke to the sound of hoofbeats outside. Thomas stood on the porch, arms full of supplies. Flour, coffee, bacon, clean linens. Thought you might need these, he said, setting everything on the table. He brought a few books too, worn but carefully chosen. Days passed in strange, peaceful rhythm. Thomas kept his distance, appearing only to check if she needed anything. Sometimes leaving fresh vegetables or meat by the door. Eleanor found herself watching for him from the window, his tall figure moving across the fields, working from sunrise to sunset. A week later, Mayor Wilson and Charles rode up to the main house. Eleanor watched from the cabin window, heart pounding. Thomas met them in the yard, arms crossed. We've come for the widow, Charles announced, loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. Mrs. Cridge isn't available, Thomas replied. That woman is carrying my brother's child. Charles snapped. Family blood. We have rights. You sold those rights in town square, Thomas reminded him. Mayor Wilson leaned forward in his saddle. There's a matter of legal documentation, Reed. The bank needs proper signatures to transfer the Cridge property. Eleanor stepped out of the cabin then, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. I haven't signed anything. All 3 men turned. Charles's face twisted into a mockery of concern. Eleanor, dear, you're not thinking clearly in your condition. Come back to town where we can care for you properly. Like you cared for me by selling me to the highest bidder? Her voice was steady, stronger than she felt. Thomas took a step closer to her, not touching but close enough that his presence offered silent support. The pregnancy is addling her mind, Charles told Thomas. She needs guidance. She seems clear-minded to me, Thomas replied. Mayor Wilson sighed dramatically. The bank forecloses on the Cridge farm next week, unless the full loan amount is paid. As a woman alone, Mrs. Cridge, you simply cannot manage such affairs. I've managed just fine since Robert died, Eleanor countered, and I never signed for any loans. Your husband did. That's enough. Charles's tone hardened. We'll return with the sheriff. Don't make this difficult, Eleanor. After they rode away, Eleanor stood trembling, not from fear, but from fury. They forged loan documents. Robert kept meticulous records. He never would have borrowed so much. Thomas studied her face. Do you have proof? Robert's ledger is hidden in the farmhouse. Charles doesn't know about it. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The child kicked restlessly within her, matching her unease. From her window, she could see the light still burning in Thomas's house across the field. Strange how the presence of a near stranger brought more comfort than her husband's own family ever had. She placed her hand on her belly. We'll fight for what's ours, she whispered to her unborn child. I promise. 3 days later, Thomas rode Eleanor's farm under cover of darkness. The ledger was exactly where she said, beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom closet. He returned muddy and exhausted, but triumphant. You were right, he said, carefully placing the worn leather book on the table. Robert's records are immaculate. No loans from the Cold Creek Bank, just a small mortgage nearly paid off. Eleanor ran her fingers over her husband's neat handwriting. He was so careful with our finances. Thomas hesitated, then placed another document beside the ledger. I found this too, hidden in the same spot. It was an envelope addressed Eleanor in Robert's handwriting. Inside was a letter and a properly filed deed to the farm, in Eleanor's name alone. He knew, she whispered, tears blurring the words. He knew Charles would try to take everything. Smart man, Thomas said quietly. Eleanor read the letter twice, her husband's voice seeming to fill the small cabin. Robert had suspected his brother's dishonesty for years. Before his illness worsened, he'd transferred the farm Eleanor's name and filed the deed with the county clerk in the next town over, away from Mayor Wilson's influence. This changes everything, Eleanor said, a new determination hardening her voice. Thomas nodded. We ride to the county seat tomorrow. Judge Parker is fair. He'll recognize the legal deed. Why are you helping me? Eleanor asked suddenly. You've done enough already. Thomas was silent for a long moment. My wife, Sarah, was pregnant when the fever took her. No one helped us. He looked away. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again. Eleanor reached across the table, not for his hand, but placing her palm flat beside his. A nearness, an understanding. They're coming with the sheriff tomorrow, she said. I know. I'm not afraid anymore. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, not as a widow to be pitied or a woman to be protected, but as an equal facing a battle. Good. You shouldn't be. Sheriff Mills looked uncomfortable as they all gathered on Thomas's porch the next morning. Eleanor and Thomas on one side, Charles, Mayor Wilson, and the bank manager on the other. We have an order to escort Mrs. Cridge back to town, the sheriff began, not meeting Eleanor's eyes. On what grounds? Thomas asked calmly. Outstanding debts, Mayor Wilson declared, and concerns for the welfare of a widow in her condition. Eleanor stepped forward, the ledger clutched in one hand, the deed in the other. I have evidence that my brother-in-law and Mayor Wilson forged loan documents against my property. Charles laughed dismissively. A woman's confused ramblings. Judge Parker won't find them confusing, Thomas said. We've already sent copies to the county seat. The sheriff frowned. What copies? Eleanor handed him Robert's ledger. My husband's financial records, showing no such loans existed. Then she presented the deed, an illegal transfer of the farm to my name before his death. Sheriff Mills studied the documents, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. This deed appears properly filed with County Clerk Hammond. Mayor Wilson paled visibly. There must be some mistake. The only mistake, Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady, was thinking I would quietly disappear. Charles lunged toward her, but Thomas stepped between them, his calm more threatening than any show of force. Sheriff Mills put a restraining hand on Charles's arm. These are serious allegations. If these documents are authentic, they are, Eleanor said, and I'm prepared to testify that my brother-in-law threatened to take my child if I didn't surrender my property. A murmur went through the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered, watching the confrontation unfold. This isn't over, Charles hissed. Yes, Thomas said quietly. It is. Sheriff Mills tucked the ledger under his arm. I'll need to take these to Judge Parker myself. In the meantime, Mrs. Cridge remains in possession of her property, and I'm ordering you both, he nodded to Charles and Mayor Wilson, to keep your distance. As they rode away, Eleanor stood tall on the porch, one hand resting protectively over her unborn child, the other gripping the porch railing. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. Thomas stood beside her, not touching but present. You did it. We did, she corrected softly. Spring came early that year. The snow melted into the thirsty earth, and the ground cracked open like it had something to say. 2 months after confrontation, Judge Parker ruled in Eleanor's favor. Charles and Mayor Wilson faced charges for forgery and fraud. Eleanor sat on the porch of her farmhouse, her own house, legally and rightfully, watching her 2-week-old son sleep in the cradle Thomas had carved. The baby had Robert's chin but Eleanor's determined eyes. Thomas rode up the path, dismounting with the easy grace of man comfortable in his skin. He'd been helping rebuild the barn that Charles had neglected. He's sleeping well, Thomas observed, keeping his voice low. Eleanor nodded. He's strong. They developed a comfortable silence over these months. Thomas still lived on his ranch, still kept mostly to himself, but the distance between their properties seemed to shrink with each passing day. "The town's different now," she remarked. "People look me in the eye again. They respect strength when they see it," Thomas replied. Eleanor smiled slightly. "I never knew I had it until I had no choice." "You always had it." She looked out across her fields, green with new growth. "Sometimes we lose everything only to discover what can never be taken away." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Cold Creek had changed, or perhaps they had. The widow wasn't an object of pity anymore, but a woman who had faced a storm and remained standing. And the silent rancher had found that some words were worth speaking after all. Some losses carve you hollow. Others reveal the strength of what remains.